Starting with white, we have Darien, King of Keldor. Darien wants us to be dealt damage because if we do, we'll make that many 1/1 soldier tokens. So besides our opponent stealing us damage, we have Angel's Trumpet. This is going to give all creatures vigilance, and at the beginning of each player's end step, we're going to tap all untapped creatures that player's controller didn't attack with this turn. Angel's Trumpet's going to deal damage to that player equal to the number of creatures tapped this way, so if we don't attack with some of our creatures, we can make even more. Ankh of Mishra. Whenever a land enters the battlefield, it's going to deal 2 damage to the land's controller. So when we play a land, we're going to make 2 1/1 soldiers. Anointed Procession. This is going to get us twice as many tokens, so 1 damage can get us 2 1/1 soldiers from our commander. Cathar's Crusade. We are making a lot of creatures enter the battlefield, so we're going to make our creatures really big with this one. Mentor of the Meek. This gets us a ton of card draw just for 1 mana each time a power 2 or less creature enters our battlefield, which is very likely with our commander. Skull Clamp. We can equip this to one of our 1/1 soldiers, and we're going to draw 2 cards when it dies. This is probably the best card draw in any token deck. And how we get ahead in the game is with the insane amount of life gain. We have Soul Warden and Soul's Attendant. When a creature enters the battlefield, we're going to gain 1 life. This includes our opponent's creatures as well. But most importantly, whenever we're dealt damage, and we have our commander on the battlefield, we gain that much life when we make the tokens from our commander. So being dealt damage doesn't bother us anymore. God Eternal Oketra. Whenever we cast a creature spell, we're going to make a 4/4 black zombie warrior creature token with vigilance. So we'll have cards like Core Skyfisher and White Mane Lion. These enter the battlefield, then they're going to have us return a permanent or more specifically a creature back to our hand. This is not a setback for us. In fact, it's really how the deck wants to perform. When we cast White Mane Lion, we can return it back to our hand when it ETBs. This will trigger our commander and make us a 4/4 zombie for 2 mana. And it's repeatable. Oketra's Monument is helpful in the deck by reducing our creature spells by 1 colorless mana. And whenever we cast a creature spell, we get a 1/1 white warrior creature token. So reducing the mana and making more tokens is super sweet. Mentor of the Meek. It's mentioned here again because of those small creatures entering our battlefield over and over again. Idol of Oblivion. This is easy card draw as long as we can make a token. Anointed Procession doubles our tokens, and we also have Umbilicus that affects each player at the upkeep. If they do not return a permanent to their hand, they have to pay 2 life. This is helpful for us in case we don't have other creatures that we can return back to our hand. Wall of Omens. This is a good example of that. When it ETBs, it doesn't give us an option to put it back into our hand. Well, cards like Jeskai Barricade can help us do that. It specifically wants another creature to return to our hand, so this works out great. Patron of the Moon. It has Moonfolk Offering, which helps us reduce the cost of our commander, and it's a flyer, and we can pay 1 mana to put 2 lands from our hand onto the battlefield, tapped. We can immediately fix that entering tapped part with Amulet of Vigor. If a permanent enters our battlefield tapped, we untap it. So for 1 mana, we now have 2 lands that enter untapped. As for the Moonfolk we can run, we have Moloku, the Clouded Mirror, Suratami Rainshaper, Suratami Savant. Not only do they help us potentially reduce the cost of our commander, but they promote putting lands back into our hand. Ruin Crab and Royal Elemental. These will help us take advantage of our lands entering the battlefield over and over. Walking Atlas also helps us put more lands into play just by tapping it. Overburden is a mean enchantment, so whenever a player puts a non-token creature onto the battlefield, that player returns a land they control to its owner's hand. This doesn't hurt us at all as long as we have our commander, and ways we abuse this is to put lands back onto our battlefield for 1 mana with our commander. As for our opponents, this will hurt. Mana Breach. Same thing as Overburden, except now it's whenever they cast a spell. Even if their spell gets countered, they still have to return a land back to their hand. Gush. Normally this is a setback for most, while we can take advantage of it. We can return 2 islands to our hand instead of paying the 4 and a blue. Then we draw 2 cards. Well, for 1 mana, we put those lands right back onto the battlefield with our commander. Unesh Cryosphinx Sovereign. It reduces the cost of our sphinxes by 2 mana and gives us a mini Factor Fiction each time a sphinx enters our battlefield. So besides adding every single sphinx you can think of, I recommend Universal Automaton. We can cast it for 0 with our commander, and we get to do our Factor Fiction, which is 4 cards instead of the 5, but for 0 mana, it doesn't get better than that. You could toss in a Sapphire Medallion to reduce the cost of all your blue spells, and now your sphinxes cost 3 less with our commander as well. High Tide is very good in all blue decks. Doubling our islands can get silly in a deck like this. Windreader Sphinx is going to get us a lot of card draw. Warden of Evos Isle can reduce another mana because all of our sphinxes are going to fly, and Sphinx of Uthun is a Factor Fiction when it enters the battlefield. Gonti, Lord of Luxury. He's going to let us look at the opponent's top 4 cards of their library. We can exile 1 card and later cast it, so ETBs are very important to us. Conjurer's Closet is probably the most consistent of the ones I'll mention. At our end step, we get to exile Gonti, make him ETB, and do this on our turn every time. Helm of of the Host. At the beginning of combat on our turn, we'll make a copy of Gonti if it's equipped to him, so the copy will ETB and get us another exiled card. Blade of Selves. It gives Gonti Myriad, so when he attacks, we'll make a copy for each other opponent we're not attacking. So if we have 3 opponents, we're going to make 2 copies of Gonti. We'll get 2 triggers, and they will be sacrificed immediately after because they are legendary. So you get the idea. ETBs should be happening a lot, but we need mana to be able to cast all these spells we're exiling, so we have Nyxos Shrine of Nyx and Cabal Stronghold. With all the mana we could possibly want, this will help us cast whatever we want. Chainer Dementia Master. For 3 black and 3 life, we can get any creature from any graveyard onto our battlefield, but when our commander leaves play, we have to remove those creatures. So we can fill our graveyard with Altar of Dementia. We can sacrifice creatures and mill a player by the creature's power, so we could choose us or even an opponent. Animate Dead grabs any creature as well for 2 mana. Viscera Seer is another great sack outlet that can help us put creatures back into our grave for a lot of great reasons. Blood Artist, whenever it or another creature dies, target player loses 1 life and we gain 1 life. Buried Alive will help us get the 3 creatures we want from our library into our graveyard. Same with Entomb, but it's an instant and it's only 1 card. Villas, Broker of Blood. Since we're losing a lot of life from our commander, Villas is a great way to draw cards. When we lose life, we draw that many cards, so 3 cards from our commander whenever we use his ability. The last card I want to mention is Grey Merchant of Asphodel. This is one of the win cons you can have in the deck. When it enters the battlefield, each opponent loses X life, where X is our devotion to black. So the 4 cards for this combo is Altar of Dementia, Chainer, Grey Merchant, and Crick, Son of Yawgmoth. Whenever Grey Merchant is in our grave, we can bring it back with our commander's ability. We don't have to pay the 3 black mana, instead we can use Crick's ability of paying 2 life for the black mana. So that's 9 life to bring back Grey Merchant. So when Grey Merchant enters, each opponent loses 7 and we lose 2 life. We then sacrifice Grey Merchant to Altar of Dementia or whatever sack outlet, and we get him back with our commander over and over. Muxus Goblin Grandee. When Muxus enters the battlefield, we're going to look at the top 6 cards of our library. We're going to get all goblins with 5 CMC or less onto the battlefield. Muxus also gets +1/+1 when it attacks for each other goblin we control. So some great goblins to grab from Muxus are Beetleback Chief, Goblin Instigator, Mogwar Marshal, and Siege Gang Commander. All of these get us more goblins when they ETB, which is really nice for just paying the 6 mana for our commander. And again, we have Conjurer's Closet, Erratic Portal, Helm of the Host, and Panharmonicon. These will get us more ETBs from our commander, so more goblins for us to get for free as well. Conjurer's Closet happens at our end step. Helm of the Host is similar, but at our combat step, it's going to get us a non-legendary copy of Muxus. Next we have Skirk Prospector. With all the goblins in the world, we can get a huge amount of mana from this goblin, Goblin Matron. This gets us any goblin to our hand, which could be Krenko Mob Boss. Such an amazing goblin, we make an absurd amount of tokens with him and easily overwhelm our opponent. Zada Hedron Grinder. Such a unique commander in the sense that whenever we target our commander with an instant or sorcery, we're going to copy that spell for each other creature we control. Some of the silly instants and sorceries to target our commander with is Expedite, Renegade Tactics, and Stun, which is neat because we draw a huge amount of cards and it's in red. Dragon Fodder and Empty the Warrens. Remember, the copies of instants and sorceries are dependent on how many creatures we have, so making more creatures is very good for the deck. Gutter Snipe and Young Pyromancer. Instants and sorceries now get us 2 damage to each opponent and 1/1 elemental creature tokens. Stormkiln Artist gets us a treasure token, which is nice because it's for whenever we cast or copy. Keyword is copy, because when we copy our instants and sorceries from our commander, we're going to have so much mana we won't even know what to do with it. And we win the game with cards like Fist of Flame. We draw a card, and until the end of turn, target creature gains trample and gets +1/+0 for each card we've drawn this turn, which, as you've seen before, is very easy for us to draw cards for 1 or 2 mana. Ruxa Patient Professor. Whenever Ruxa enters the battlefield or attacks, we can return target creature with no abilities from our graveyard to our hand. Creatures we control with no abilities get +1/+1, and we can have creatures we control with no abilities assign their combat damage as though they were not blocked. So creatures with no abilities really matter in this deck. Ancient Brontodon, Gigantosaurus, Leatherback Baloth, these are the kinds of creatures we're needing to get +1/+1, and we can just attack and not have them blocked. Imagine a 10/10 coming at an opponent, and they can't block it. Only removal spells can stop us now. Tendershoot Dryad, Avenger of Zendikar. Now these creatures do have abilities, but the creatures they make are ones with no abilities, so lots of potential damage from these. We draw cards from Soul of the Harvest, Keeper of Fables, and Toski, Bearer of Secrets. Whenever we cast a creature, we'll draw a card. Whenever we attack an opponent, which they won't be able to block anyways, we'll draw a card. Whenever we deal combat damage, we'll draw a card. And again, yes, these have abilities, but there needs to be a way we are constantly getting our creatures with no abilities. Muruganda Petroglyphs. This is promoting creatures with no abilities by giving them +2/+2, but this also means for our opponents as well. Titania Protector of Argoth. We want lands from our battlefield to the graveyard, and we're going to make 5/3 elementals when we do. Sylvan Safekeeper is a great option to sack lands. It even gives one of our creatures Shroud. Zurin Orb is going to let us sacrifice a land, and we're going to gain 2 life. Constant Miss is a neat one that lets us cast it for 2. The buyback is sacking a land, and then creatures deal no combat damage. With all of the lands in our graveyard, Crucible of Worlds and Raminamp Excavator are perfect for playing lands from our graveyard. Roiling Regrowth. It's a ramp spell that lets us sack a land. We're going to get 2 basics, and this can make a 5/3 elemental with our commander. Elemental Bond and Garruk's Uprising get us really good card draw in the deck. We have creatures with at least power 3 or 4 entering our battlefield over and over. So first we're going to talk about 8.5 Tails. For 2 white, it's a 2/2 Fox Cleric. The first ability is we pay 1 and a white. Target permanent you control gains protection from white until end of turn. We can pay a colorless, and then target spell or permanent becomes white until end of turn. What's really cool is that these feed into each other. So for example, if someone wants to terminate our commander, we can make that spell white with 8.5 Tails' second ability. Then we can give our commander protection from white with 8.5 Tails' first ability. This can get really annoying, because it seems like our opponents can't do anything to mess with our board. When it comes to board wipes, that's going to get around protection, so that is where the deck fails. But let's talk about the cards you can expect in this type of deck. Circle of Protection White. We can pay 1, and the next time a white source of our choice would deal damage to us, we can prevent that damage. Well, with our commander, we can make a permanent white, so if they attack us with a huge Eldrazi or something that's going to kill us immediately, we can make that permanent white, and then we can prevent the damage that white source would deal us. This can get really dumb, because as long as we have the mana, we're going to stay alive. Again, the same thing with Rune of Protection White. We can pay a white and prevent all damage to us from a white source. We can cast things like Glare of Heresy. We can exile target white permanent. So for 3 mana total, we can exile permanents instead of just the normal 7. Now, I've seen this built a couple of ways, but the one I want to mention is Voltron. So pretty much you get all the swords, or any auras, equip it to our commander, so it has protection from anything, and we deal commander damage and we win the game. But really, you can build this however you want. It's a mono white deck, so of course it's going to have its limits, but now that we can have protection from pretty much everything, this is a really cool commander. Next, let's talk about Kaiga the Tidestar. For 5 and a blue, it's a 5/5 Dragon Spirit with flying. When it dies, we can gain control of target creature. So how this would be built is that it's okay if our commander dies, because we're going to be making a bunch of copies. And now, there is a legendary rule. There can't be 2 of the same legendary creature on just one battlefield, so one will have to die. So for example, when we cast things like Cackling Counterpart, just for 3 mana, we can create a token that's a copy of target creature we control. So for 3 mana, we make a copy of our commander. One has to die. So that means we get to gain control of target creature just for 3 mana. And the cool thing is we get to keep this creature. It's not just until end of turn. Another card is Quasi-Duplicate. Again, for another 3 mana, we can create a token that's a copy of target creature. It also has Jumpstart, so by discarding a card and paying another 3 mana, we can do this again, and then we'll have to exile it. There's creatures that come in as copies as well, with Mirror Image, Clone, Cryptoplasm, and Stunt Double. So yes, this is going to rely on our opponent's decks, really, because we want to gain control of their creatures. Another silly card in this deck is Royal Elemental for 3 blue. It's a 3/2 elemental with flying. It also has Landfall, so whenever a land enters our battlefield, we can gain control of target creature as long as we control Royal Elemental. So yes, this has that little exception there, but still, when we play a land, we're going to take one of our opponent's creatures. This gets really dumb. So if you don't care about your commander dying, and you love to copy your opponent's creatures, I really recommend this one to you. Next, we're talking about Blim Comedic Genius for 2 black and red. It's a 4/3 imp with flying. When it deals combat damage to a player, that player gains control of target permanent you control. Then each player loses life and discards a card equal to the number of permanents they control but don't own. What's really nice is that we get to choose what permanent they gain control of, and they can't refuse your generous gift. What's really cool is that the players will lose life and discard cards for all permanents they control but don't own, not just the ones they received from us. And this control change effect is indefinite. It doesn't wear off, and it doesn't expire when Blim leaves the battlefield. But if we do leave the game, we get our permanents back, and this will no longer happen. So some cards we can find in a deck like this is Demonic Lore for 2 and a black. It's an enchantment. When it enters the battlefield, we get to draw 3. But at the beginning of our end step, we have to lose 2 life for each card in our hand. So that doesn't seem really good, but it's really good when we give it to our opponent. And a classic is Harmless Offering for 2 and a red. It's a sorcery. Target opponent gains control of target permanent permanent you control. You're going to find this in a lot of decks that want to give permanents to other players, and for 3 mana this isn't too bad. Now, pretty rough one is Demonic Pact for 2 black. It's an enchantment. At the beginning of your upkeep, choose one that hasn't been chosen. It can deal 4 damage to target creature or player. We gain 4 life, target opponent discards 2 cards, you draw 2, and the last one is you lose the game. What's really rough is that we can choose the first 3 modes. So we can deal 4 damage to target creature or player, gain 4 life, we can have somebody discard 2, we can draw 2, and right before it gets to our 4th upkeep, we can give this to an opponent. This is so horrible, but really awesome because it's like just ticking down and our opponents should know what's going to happen. But yeah, this is a great card to have in the deck. Humble Defector is another great one. We can draw 2 and then we're going to give it to our opponent, which may not seem really good because they have the opportunity to draw 2 as well, but with our commander, they're going to be losing life and discarding cards, so it's actually really worth it. Bazaar Trader, for 1 and a red, we can tap it and target player gains control of target artifact, creature, or land you control. So we don't just have to use our commander or all these other cards, we can actually just tap Bazaar Trader, give them a land or whatever we need to make them start losing life and discarding cards. Some more mean things we can do is Steel Golem. You can't play creature spells. Of course, if they have a sack outlet, that won't be really worth it, but if they're not able to interact with this card, we can pretty much shut them off. Same with Grid Monitor. It's the same card, just 1 more mana. So if you love to give your opponents your cards, make them lose life and discard cards just for owning those permanents, this is a great commander for you. Thromach the Insatiable. For 3 red and green, it's a 0/0 Hellion, but it has Devour X, where X is the number of creatures devoured this way. So when it enters the battlefield, we can sacrifice any number of creatures. This creature enters the battlefield with X +1/+1 counters on it for each one of those creatures. But what's really cool about Thromach is that it has Devour X. So whatever number of creatures we sacrifice, we're actually going to square that. So if we devour 1 creature, Thromach's going to enter with a 1/1 counter. If we devour 2 creatures, 4, devour 3, we get 9. So this can get really crazy if we have a bunch of tokens, and that's exactly what this deck wants to do. So for example, we have cards like Dragon Lair Spider. It is 6 mana, but hear me out. When an opponent casts a spell, we make a 1/1 green insect creature token onto the battlefield. And our opponents are going to cast a lot of spells, so we're going to have a lot of tokens, especially with Scute Swarm. When a land enters the battlefield under our control, we're going to make a 1/1 green insect, and if we control more than 6 lands, we make a copy of Scute Swarm. Yeah, we're going to be making a bunch of tokens, especially with Awakening Zone. This is one of my favorites. At our upkeep, we get to make an Eldrazi spawn, and we can also sacrifice it to make 1 mana. So after we have a bunch of tokens made, we actually win the game with cards like Chandra's Ignition. So for 5 mana, we can have target creature you control deals damage equal to its power to each other creature and each opponent. So if we have devoured 7 creatures, our commander's a 49/49. We can cast Chandra's Ignition, deal each opponent and each other creature 49 damage, and we'll pretty much win the game. Or if we just want to hit 1 opponent, we can use cards like Thud and Soul's Fire. So if you want to make a bunch of tokens and eventually sacrifice them to your commander and then kill everybody with your commander, this is a great deck for you. Yannette Cryptic Sovereign. For 2 white, blue, black, it's a 3/5 Sphinx with Flying, Vigilance, and Menace. Whenever it attacks, we're going to reveal the top card of our library, and if that card's converted mana cost is odd, we can cast it without paying its mana cost, otherwise draw a card. So our commander's going to love to attack, and that's very important to us. And we also care about odd CMC, so we can draw a lot of cards with Vega the Watcher. This is a 3 mana card, so if we reveal it from the top of our library when our commander attacks, we can cast this for free, but it says when you cast a spell from anywhere other than your hand, draw a card, and we're going to be doing that a lot with this deck. We can cast things like Engarrick's Wake, which is a board wipe that doesn't affect us at all and just our opponents. We can manipulate the top card of our library with Crystal Ball. It is an odd CMC spell, but we can pay 1 and tap it to scry 2, so we can manipulate the top card of our library. So maybe we don't want the top card, and we'd rather have the second one. We can just do a little bit of a switcheroo, and then we're all set for when our commander attacks. Being unblockable is going to be important, so we can use cards like Whisper Silk Cloak. It is an odd CMC, but it's going to make our commander unblockable, and our commander will have Shroud, so that means we can't target it, but more importantly, our opponents can't target our commander as well. We can cast dumb things like Blazing Archon. Creatures can't attack us. We can cast Sepulchral Primordial. When it enters the battlefield, we can grab a creature from each opponent's graveyard and put it under our control. There's Doom Whisperer. We can pay 2 life to surveil 2, which means we can look at the top 2 and we can put any number of them into our graveyard. So it's like scrying, except we can only work with the top cards of our library, and if we don't want them there, we have to put them in our grave. There's a lot of cards with odd CMC, so if you want a really unique commander that loves our commander attacking and focuses on only odd CMC, I really recommend this one. Gahiji Honored One for 2 red, green, white. It's a 4/4 beast, and it says whenever a creature attacks one of your opponents or a planeswalker an opponent controls, that creature gets +2/+0 until end of turn. So usually you're going to find Naya or red, green, white to be the colors where we are attacking, but now this is promoting our opponents to hit each other, and they're going to get extra damage when they do. So what's really crazy is we can cast cards like Sylvan Offering, where we're going to make a bunch of tokens, not only for us, but an opponent as well. So already we're promoting, hey, please hit your opponents. Here's a huge creature to do that. Shiny Impetus, this is going to make it where when the enchanted creature attacks, we get a treasure token, and that creature gets +2/+2, and it's goaded. So it has to attack another player other than us if able. Rite of the Raging Storm. So this is an enchantment where we're going to make Lightning Ragers, and they can't attack us or planeswalkers we control. At the beginning of each player's upkeep, they make a 5/1 red elemental named Lightning Rager. They're going to put it onto the battlefield. It has trample, haste, and at their end step, they have to sacrifice it. So if we have our commander out, that's a 7/1. It can't attack us or a planeswalker we control. Trample and haste, yeah, this is a nasty card. We can also have cards like Gisela Blade of Gold Knight. When our opponents hit each other, it's now going to be double that damage, and when they hit us, it's going to be half that. We can make it to where our opponents have to attack with cards like Goblin Spymaster. So at the beginning of each opponent's end step, they're going to create a 1/1 red goblin creature token with creatures you control attack each combat if able. So a lot of creatures are going to be dying, and hopefully they're not going to be coming at us, and we're not going to be taking a lot of damage. So hopefully we're going to win the game by making a bunch of tokens, buffing up our opponent's creatures, and hopefully they're not going to be attacking us. Next we're going to be talking about Amareth the Lustrous for 3 green, white, blue. It's a 6/6 dragon with flying. Whenever another permanent enters the battlefield under your control, look at the top card of your library. If it shares a card type with that permanent, you may reveal that card and put it into your hand. So you actually don't have to play some kind of enchantment, artifact themed deck. You can really build this however you want, and if you happen to share the same type of permanent, this is a really great commander. So this could be creature, enchantment, artifact, land focused, and we really benefit from just getting cards to our hand. So for example, you can see cards like Smothering Tithe. It is an enchantment, but we make a lot of treasure tokens, and they happen to be artifacts. So when an opponent draws and they don't pay the 2 mana, we can make a treasure token. It's going to enter our battlefield. We can look at the top card of our library, and if it's an artifact, we can put that into our hand, and that's really powerful. You can find cards like Brago King Eternal and Yorion Sky Nomad. This makes it where a lot of our permanents now are going to ETB a lot. So that means we're going to be looking at the top card of our library a lot, because Brago says, when Brago deals combat damage to a player, exile any number of target non-land permanents you control. Then return those cards to the battlefield under their owner's control. So if we have Commander Sphere enter the battlefield, that means we get to look at the top card of our library, and it's an artifact. Again, we can get that to our hand. So if you're playing an enchantment deck, we have cards like Satyr Enchanter and Mesa Enchantress. Whenever we cast an enchantment, we get to draw a card. Well, casting comes before the permanent entering the battlefield. So we can cast an enchantment, we'll draw a card, and when it enters the battlefield, we can see if the top card of our library is an enchantment. And if it is, we get to put it into our hand. This is just a great commander, and it's a lot of fun to play. Volrath the Shapestealer for 2 black, green, blue. It's a 7/5 shapeshifter. At the beginning of combat on your turn, put a -1/-1 counter on up to 1 target creature. We can pay 1, and until our next turn, Volrath the Shapestealer becomes a copy of target creature with a counter on it, except it's a 7/5 and has this ability. What's important is that it says target creature with a counter on it. It doesn't have to be that -1/-1 that we get to put on a creature at the beginning of our combat. So we can actually cast cards like Generous Patron. When it enters the battlefield, we can support 2, which means we can put a +1/+1 counter on each of up to 2 target creatures. So we could be putting these counters on our opponent's creatures and then eventually copying them with our commander. We also have Forgotten Ancient. When a player casts a spell, we can put a +1/+1 counter on Forgotten Ancient. At the beginning of our upkeep, we can move those counters to any creatures. So that means if they have a really great creature, we can move a +1/+1 counter on it. Yes, it's going to get bigger, but now our commander can become a copy of it. Evolutionary Escalation. It's 2 mana, it's an enchantment, and at the beginning of your upkeep, we can put 3 +1/+1 counters on target creature you control and 3 +1/+1 counters on target creature an opponent controls. So both of these creatures are going to get bigger, but then we can target it with our commander, and Volrath can become a copy of it later. So if you love +1/+1 counters and being able to copy creatures, whether it's ours or opponents, this is a great one for you. The last commander we're going to be talking about is Ramos Dragon Engine for 6 mana. It's a 4/4 dragon with flying. Whenever you cast a spell, put a +1/+1 counter on Ramos Dragon Engine for each of that spell's colors. Remove 5 +1/+1 counters from Ramos, add white, white, blue, blue, black, black, red, red, green, green. Activate this only once each turn. So it's very important that we cast spells with a lot of colors in it. So for example, all of the charms, such as Abzan, Jund, Sultai, that whole cycle, doesn't really matter what they do because we're going to be making a lot of counters on our commander, and that means a lot more free mana we could be using. We can also have cards like Corpse Jack Menace. If a +1/+1 counter would be put on a creature we control, we actually do twice that many. So when we cast charms, instead of just putting 3 counters on our commander, we can end up putting 6 counters, and that means 10 free mana, just like that. I really like cards like Villainous Wealth already by itself, but when it's in this deck, we get 3 counters on our commander. But what the card does is that we can exile the top X cards of an opponent's library, and we can actually cast those for free as long as it's X or less, or whatever we put into it. We can cast cards like Atraxa, which already she's going to help us proliferate, but she is 4 colors, so that means we're going to have 4 counters on our commander. We have cards like Evolution Sage. Whenever a land enters the battlefield under our control, we get to proliferate, and this is great for getting more counters on our commander. We have Maelstrom Archangel. For white, blue, black, red, green, it's a 5/5 angel with flying. When it deals combat damage to a player, we can actually cast a spell from our hand without paying its mana cost. So again, we put 5 counters on Ramos. We deal combat damage to a player, we get to cast spells for free, we get that 10 mana for free. This is just a great one to have in it. Deep Glow Skate's going to double our counters on any number of permanents. And again, Forgotten Ancient can move counters to our commander just by players casting their spells. Zada Hedron Grinder. This is Tomer's deck from MTG Commander, originally to be $25 for the deck, but of course time effects magic cards, and it does cost around $40 now. Zada is very powerful, and it takes advantage of our instants and sorceries targeting our commander, and we can then copy those to each other creature we control. So with the token theme helping accomplish this, we have cards like Dragon Fodder, Empty the Warrens, Firecat Blitz, and Goblin War Party. Whatever the token is, we just care about creatures, because we want to keep getting better copies with the more creatures we have. There's also Hordling Outburst, Honor the God Pharaoh, Krenko's Command, and Kadoltha Rebirth. So with all of these tokens, we're going to start taking advantage of card draw, and we can do this for 1 or 2 red mana. We have things like Accelerate. This is an instant that gives a creature haste until end of turn, and we get to draw a card. So when we target our commander with Accelerate, let's say we have 9 other tokens, so we have 10 creatures on the battlefield total, we will be able to draw 10 cards, because we're going to copy this for each other creature we control. So 10 cards for 2 mana is silly and very powerful. Same with Boiling Blood. Target creature attacks this turn if able, and we're going to draw a card. Now while this is 3 mana, we're also giving the possibility of losing our creatures because they're going to attack. Downhill Charge is really cool. We can sacrifice a mountain rather than pay the cost, and target creature is going to get +X/+0 until end of turn, where X is the number of mountains we control. There's also Expedite, which is a better version of Accelerate by just being the 1 red mana. Target creature gains haste until end of turn, and we get to draw a card. And usually how we're going to end up winning the game is with this card, Fists of Flame. For 1 and a red, we draw a card, and until end of turn, target creature gains trample and +1/+0 for each card you've drawn this turn. So a very powerful deck, and on a budget. Speaking of Tomer and on a budget, there's another one of his decks I recommend, which is Gargos, Vicious Watcher. Again, this is meant to be $25, but now is around $40, and this isn't exactly Hydra Tribal like most decks. This is a deck that wants its creatures to be targeted, and we get to fight with our commander Gargos. We also have ways to draw cards, and we can do that with certain creatures like Gnarlback Rhino. So whenever a spell targets Gnarlback Rhino, we get to draw a card, and it's a 4/4 trample. And whenever we have our commander out, as well as Gnarlback Rhino, whenever we target our commander or Gnarlback Rhino, we're going to start being able to fight creatures with our commander. We're drawing cards. It's a great system. And with the creatures we have in the deck, we can start drawing cards through combat. So whenever we have Keeper of Fables out, whenever 1 or more non-human creatures we control deal combat damage to a player, we're going to get to draw a card. There's also Occame Adversary, that whenever it deals combat damage to a player, we get to draw a card. There's also Orin Viper. Whenever it deals combat damage to a player, we get to draw. We have Regal Force, that says whenever it enters the battlefield, we'll draw a card for each green creature we control. There's Voice of Many. When it enters the battlefield, we'll draw a card for each opponent who controls fewer creatures than us. And we also have Drum Hunter, so at the beginning of our end step, if we control a creature with power 5 or greater, which our commander meets that need, we may draw a card, and it's also a mana dork. So we can start targeting our creatures with cards like Aspect of Hydra. So for 1 green mana, we can have target creature get +X/+X until end of turn, where X is our devotion to green, and our commander already meets 3 of that, which is very powerful. We have Blossoming Defense. We can give a creature +2/+2 and hexproof until end of turn. There's also Hunter's Insight, which will help us with card draw. Target creature we control control is going to start drawing his cards whenever they deal combat damage to a player or planeswalker this turn. We draw that many cards. So if our commander hits a player or planeswalker, we can draw 8 cards. It also has Vigilance, which is very powerful. There's Invigorate, which instead of casting this spell, we can control a forest and we can have an opponent gain 3 life. And target creature gets +4/+4 until end of turn. Ultimately, what's important is that we're targeting our creatures so our commander can start fighting stuff, and we just take advantage of all of that. Speaking of targeting our creatures, we have Whipsilk, which is an enchantment for 1 green that says the enchanted creature may block as though it had flying, but more importantly, we can pay a green to return this back to our hand. So for 2 mana, we can keep repeating this, targeting our creatures, having our creatures fight things, and also if we need, we can give a creature reach. Now, there are Hydras in here, but again, this isn't Hydra Tribal, so there's only a few to mention. We have Genesis Hydra, Hydra Omnivore, and Nesting Wilds Ravager. What's cool is that our commander's already going to take off that 4 mana less to cast these creatures, so we can end up paying just 2 mana for these, or like Genesis Hydra, that's 4 mana we don't have to pay, still just paying the 2 green, and we can pay more into it as well. Next up, we're talking about a deck that I built. This is Kazul, Tyrant of the Cliffs. This deck cares about forced combat, and if our opponents happen to swing at us, we get to create 3/3 ogres if they don't pay 3 mana for each creature attacking us. We get to force combat with Warmonger Hellkite, Rage Nimbus, Heckling Fiends, and Goblin Diplomats. By making our opponent's creatures attack, it is likely they could attack an opponent, which is completely fine. That's just more life that we don't have to work on attacking our opponents with. But remember, if they do attack us, we get those 3/3 ogres. So whenever we're creating those tokens, we can rely on cards like Warstorm Surge. Whenever a creature enters the battlefield under our control, it deals damage equal to its power to any target. So we're creating essentially lightning bolts whenever we create those 3/3 ogres. So if an opponent happens to attack us with 3 creatures that we forced them to or haven't forced them, and they decide not to pay 9 mana because they have to pay for each creature attacking us, we then get 9 damage to deal to whatever target. This can be our opponents, the creatures attacking us, whatever we want. And we still get those 3/3s, which is very powerful. So we also take advantage of making these tokens with Relentless Assault. This is going to let us untap all of our creatures that attack this turn, and after this main phase, there's an additional combat phase followed by an additional main phase. So we're able to attack with those creatures we just made when it's our turn again. We can also take advantage of all these creatures with cards like Battle Hymn. We now have a red mana for each creature we control. And if we need to board wipe, since we're already promoting creatures towards chain reaction, that's going to make it easier to kill all the creatures that we need to, especially because this is a very cheap and affordable board wipe, not just money-wise, but mana cost as well. It deals X to each creature, where X is the number of creatures on the battlefield. So if there's 10 creatures, for 4 mana, we deal 10 damage to each creature. Super cool. So we can bring Monarch into the game with cards like Emberwald Captain and Court of Ire. And what's really cool about Monarch is that this promotes everybody to start hitting each other, so our opponents may think it's worth to swing at us. We even get to make that token if they don't pay 3 mana, because Monarch's going to let us draw a card at the beginning of our end step. And we also get some nice rewards if we are the Monarch with these cards. The last deck I want to talk about is originally from Dan from my Discord. This is his Min Wily Illusionist deck. This deck is Illusion Tribal, and it wants to draw at least 2 cards on everyone's turn. And it's no joke because it gets out of hand whenever Min can stay on the battlefield. Now, besides drawing cards to make our illusions, we can play cards like Archmage Emeritus. Whenever we cast an instant or sorcery spell, we're drawing a card, and this can have us drawing cards in our opponent's turn as well. There's Curiosity Crafter. Whenever a creature token deals combat damage to a player, we draw a card. Whenever Illusory Ambusher is dealt damage, we draw that many cards. Or we also have cards like Opt, which is for 1 blue, we get to scry 1 and draw a card. Now we can make our illusion tokens that are made with Min unblockable with creatures like Tetsuko Umezawa Fugitive. This now makes creatures we control with power or toughness 1 or less unblockable. And this is great because the illusions that we're making with Min get +1/+0 for each other illusion we control, especially because they're 1/1s. And also, whenever an illusion we control dies, we can put a permanent card with mana value less than or equal to that creature's power from our hand onto the battlefield. So huge illusions can get us huge permanents. Or we can always drop lands, which we have 33 of them. So this can really take advantage of if there happens to be a board wipe, we're still going to be able to come back from it. Now, to guarantee that we're drawing cards on each player's turn, we have cards like Behold the Multiverse, Brainstorm, Chemister's Insight, and Archmage's Charm. These all let us draw at least 2 cards and their instants, so we're going to be able to cover that. So we'll be able to make some illusions with our commander. If they happen to die later in the game, we get to put permanents from our hand onto the battlefield, less than or equal to their power. That is super cool. And if you're Maldruk and Feminologist for 1 green blue, it's a 3/2 human scout. You and permanents you control have protection from salamanders. At the beginning of your end step, each player who controls the fewest creatures creates a 4/3 blue salamander warrior creature token. So if you're like me, initially I thought this was a really weird commander, and I'm like, how would this even work? Well, turns out there's a lot of cards that can make this deck actually really fun to play. Image Crafter, it costs 1 blue, it's a 1/1 wizard. We can tap it, choose a creature type other than legend or wall. Target creature's type becomes that type until end of turn. Well, we can make it a salamander, and since us and our permanents have protection from salamanders, our opponents have no other choice than to hit our opponents. And you're going to find a lot of cards that can make this happen, such as Mistform Mutant. For 6 mana, we get a 3/4 Illusion Mutant. We can pay 1 and a blue to choose a creature type other than legend or wall, and again, that can become a salamander, so we'll have protection from those creatures. A really sweet card is Peer Pressure. For 4 mana, it's a sorcery. We can choose a creature type, so let's choose Salamander. If you control more creatures of that type than any other player, you gain control of all creatures of that type. So if we control 3 or 4 Salamanders, and our opponents maybe only control 1 creature, and we happen to make them a Salamander that turn, we now have control of all of their creatures as well. Now, a silly card is Coat of Arms. If we make all of our opponents' creatures Salamanders, they're going to be huge creatures because they get +1/+1 for each other matching creature that shares a creature type. So if there's 3 salamanders on the battlefield, each of them will get +2/+2. So whatever the total number of the creature type is, just subtract 1 and that'll be the bonus that they get. A great way to draw cards is Edric Spymaster of Trest. Whenever a creature deals combat damage to one of your opponents, its controller may draw a card. So this is not only going to promote us to draw cards, but our opponents, most importantly, because salamanders aren't going to be able to do anything to us, so they're going to want to swing at their opponents, and now we're promoting card draw if they make contact with them, so our opponents are going to die much faster, and we have the possibility of drawing cards as well. Next, we're talking about Sisea Orochi Ascendant. For 1 green, we have a 2/3 Snake Monk. We can reveal our hand, and if we have 7 or more lands in our hand, we can flip Sisea, which then becomes a legendary enchantment that whenever a land you control is tapped for mana, add 1 mana of that type to your mana pool for each other land you control with the same name. So for example, if we have 4 forests, we tap 1, we're going to get 4 mana from that forest. And this is a very powerful enchantment, but remember we have to get 7 or more lands to our hand, so we can do that with Magus of the Library. We can tap to get 1 colorless mana, or we can draw a card, but we can only do this if we have 7 or more cards in our hand. So hopefully this can get us extra lands at the beginning of the game. We also have Sprouting Vines. What's important is that, yes, it can get us a basic land to our hand, but it has storms. So if players are really interacting with each other, and a lot of spells have been cast during someone's turn, we can cast it, and Storm is really going to help us get a lot more basics to our hand. Yavimaya Elder, when it dies, we can get 2 basics to our hand. Abundance is a great card in this deck. Whenever we would draw a card, we can choose land or non-land, and we're going to reveal cards until we get that specific card. Journey of Discovery. We're usually just going to pay 3 mana and not the Entwine cost, which lets us choose both, but we're going to search our library for 2 basics and put it into our hand. Now, since we're going to have a huge amount of mana, we can actually end up getting infinite mana with cards like Wake Root Elemental. We can pay 5 green to untap target land we control. Well, if we have 6 forests out, we can tap 1 forest for 6 mana, pay 5 to untap a land, and then we'll just have 1 additional green every time, so we're going to have infinite green mana. And when we have infinite green mana, we can start spending that with cards like Jade Mage and Ant Queen. This is just 2 or 3 mana to make a token, and then we can have infinite tokens. We can also use Genesis Wave to reveal the top X cards of our library. Well, if we have infinite mana, we're just literally going to put our deck onto the battlefield. And then we can also win the game with cards like Helix Pinnacle. For 1 green, it's an enchantment that has Shroud, so we can't target it, and neither can our opponents. We can pay X mana to put that many tower counters on Helix Pinnacle, and we win the game if we have 100 or more tower counters on it at the beginning of our upkeep. So this is a really cool deck, especially if you want a huge amount of mana. I really recommend this one. Next, we're talking about Marchesa the Black Rose. For 1 blue, black, red. It's a 3/3 human wizard with Dethrone. Whenever this creature attacks the player with the most life, or tied for the most life, put a +1/+1 counter on it. Other creatures you control have Dethrone. And finally, we have whenever a creature you control with a +1/+1 counter on it dies, return that card to the battlefield under your control at the beginning of the next end step. So we could attack the player with the highest life total, or we can have ways to put counters on our creatures already. One of the best cards in this deck is Unspeakable Symbol. For 1 black, black. It's an enchantment. We can pay 3 life to put a +1/+1 counter on target creature. So if our creatures don't have haste, we don't have to wait an extra turn to be able to protect our creatures. And if our opponents try to destroy our creatures, in response we can pay 3 life and put a +1/+1 counter on our creatures to make them come back the next end step. So a great creature to have +1/+1 counters on is Moldrifter. When it enters the battlefield, we can draw 2 cards. Well, if we put a +1/+1 counter on it, and it dies, we can then have it enter the battlefield at the next end step. This can be ours or even our opponent's end step. If you're looking to steal your opponent's cards, Two great options are Gonti, Lord of Luxury, and Hostage Taker. When they enter the battlefield, we can start taking our opponent's cards. So Gonti's going to let us look at the top 4 of our opponent's cards. We can take one, and the rest are going to go randomly on the bottom of their library. We also have Hostage Taker. This can take any artifact or creature that's already on their battlefield, and we can then cast it again for any mana of any type. If it were to leave the battlefield, we would have to return that spell back. But if we cast it before it leaves the battlefield, then there's no valid target for it. Once we cast that spell, we can then sacrifice Hostage Taker and keep repeating this over and over, taking their artifacts or creatures that are still on their battlefield. Disciple of Bolas is another great way to draw cards, and it's going to be able to help us sacrifice our creatures so they can again enter the battlefield, and we can get even more value. So when this enters the battlefield, we can sacrifice another creature, we gain X life and draw X cards, where X is that creature's power. So if we sacrifice Mole Drifter, we can gain 2 life, draw 2 cards, and then at the next end step, if Mole Drifter had a +1/+1 counter on it, it's going to come back to the battlefield. We're going to draw an additional 2 cards. A little bit of a slow way to ramp is Burnished Heart. We have to pay 3 to cast it, pay another 3 to sack it, and get 2 basics on the battlefield tapped. Well, if we're able to put a +1/+1 counter on Burnished Heart, we can then pay 3, sack it, get 2 basics, and we can keep doing this over and over. And a great sack outlet for this deck is Ashnod's Altar. We can sacrifice a creature, get 2 colorless mana, which can then help us cast another spell or even put mana into Burnished Heart to then sacrifice that. Now, my favorite card in this type of deck is Molten Primordial. It costs 7 mana, but wait for this. It has haste, it's a 6/4, so already it's a huge creature. When it enters the battlefield, for each opponent, gain control of up to 1 target creature that player controls until end of turn. Untap those creatures, they gain haste until end of turn. We can end up taking a lot of creatures with Molten Primordial, especially if it has a +1/+1 counter, and we can do a lot of damage if our opponents have really good creatures on their battlefield. So this goes to show you don't just have to have combat in order to have +1/+1 counters on your creatures. If you want a little bit of a different Grixis type deck, this is a great option for you. The next commander we're talking about is Urtai the Corrupted for 2 white, blue, black. It's a 3/4 wizard, and it has an interesting ability. We can pay a blue, tap Urtai, and sacrifice a creature or enchantment, counter target spell. So initially when I saw this commander, I thought it was a little weird. Why does it want us to sacrifice creatures and enchantments? And most importantly, how can we abuse this? Reassembling Skeleton. People don't think much of this card, but it's actually really powerful in this deck. It costs 1 and a black for a 1/1 skeleton warrior, but the ability it has is for 1 and a black, we can return Reassembling Skeleton from our graveyard to the battlefield tapped. So this way we're always going to have a way to sacrifice a creature with our commander, and we're going to be able to counter whatever spell we need to. We can also untap our commander with cards like Fate Stitcher. So if we really need to and we have that extra blue mana, we can counter another spell, maybe sacrifice another card like Reassembling Skeleton or whatever other sack fodder we may have. Some of the weird enchantments we can sacrifice is Treacherous Blessing for 2 and a black. It's an enchantment. When it enters the battlefield, we draw 3 cards. Whenever you cast a spell, you lose 1 life, and whenever Treacherous Blessing becomes the target of a spell or ability, we have to sacrifice it. So we can already sacrifice it anyways with our commander, but more importantly, when it enters the battlefield, we can draw 3 cards. And if we need to get that card back, we have cards like Hannah's Ship's Navigator. For 1 white, blue, we can return target artifact or enchantment card from our graveyard back to our hand. So if we need to draw another 3 cards, we're going to have to pay 6 mana, but we get a lot of value just by sacrificing our creatures and enchantments with our commander. We can make all of our permanents enchantments in addition to the types with cards like Enchanted Evening, so now we can start sacrificing our lands, our artifacts, whatever we need to counter whatever spells that are going to mess with us. We can draw a lot of cards with Mesa Enchantress, because whenever we cast an enchantment, we're drawing a card. We can cast things like Induced Amnesia. For 2 and a blue, it's an enchantment. When it enters the battlefield, target player exiles all cards from his or her hand face down, then draws that many. When Induced Amnesia is put into the graveyard from the battlefield, return all the exiled cards to their owner's hand. This can be a lot of card draw. We're technically not drawing the cards that are put back into our hand, but this is a really cool way to get more cards to our hand, especially because we're going to need things to sacrifice anyways. This just works perfectly. Hatching Plans. When it's put into the graveyard from play, or when it's destroyed, we can draw 3 cards. And the last card I want to talk about, which is really sweet, is Lol Mage Mentor. For 1 and 2 blue, it's a 2/2 Merfolk Wizard. Whenever a spell or ability you control counters a spell, you may put a 1/1 blue Merfolk creature token onto the battlefield. We can tap 7 untap Merfolk we control to counter a target spell. So again, more ways to counter spells, and it's sack fodder for our commander, because remember, we can sacrifice a creature to still counter a spell, so this is just a great card in the deck. If you're looking for a really unique commander, this is the one for you. Next, we're talking about Kazul, Tyrant of the Cliffs for 3 red. It's a 5/4 Ogre Warrior. Whenever a creature an opponent controls attacks, if you're the defending player, create a 3/3 red Ogre creature token unless that creature's controller pays 3 mana. This can be a lot of mana, especially if our opponents are attacking with a million 1/1s. Well, now we have a million 3/3 red Ogre creature tokens, because they're not going to be able to pay, hopefully, 3 million mana. So it's important for us to find ways to be able to make our opponents attack. We can't really determine if they're going to attack us, but the card I want to talk about is War's Toll. For 4 mana, it's an enchantment. Whenever an opponent taps a land for mana, they have to tap all their lands. And the important part is, if a creature an opponent controls attacks, all creatures that opponent controls attack if able. So they're going to have to swing with everything if they decide to even swing with one creature. Goblin Spymaster is another great one. At the beginning of each opponent's end step, they get a 1/1 red goblin with creatures you control attack each combat if able. This can get really annoying, especially if they have their commander out. They can end up losing their commander because they have to attack with it. And then we have Goblin Diplomats. We can tap it. Each creature attacks this turn if able. Sadly, we can't determine if those creatures are going to be attacking us, but if they decide to, we get 3/3 ogres, because are they really going to want to pay 3 mana per creature attacking us? Probably not. A really interesting card is Curse of Opulence. We can enchant a player, and if the enchanted player is attacked, we can create a colorless artifact token named Gold. It has sacrifice this artifact, add 1 mana of that color to your mana pool. Each opponent attacking that player does the same, so we're always going to get that gold token, and if an opponent decides to attack the enchanted player, they get one as well. Now, how we make our opponents attack us are with cards like Trove of Temptation. It's an enchantment that says each opponent must attack you or a planeswalker you control with at least 1 creature each combat if able. At the beginning of your end step, we're going to make a treasure token, which normally this sounds horrible, but in this deck, it is amazing, because we can also, again with the previous cards I mentioned, with War's Toll, they have to attack with all of their creatures, so that means a lot of ogres we're going to be making. And we get a treasure token just because. Emberwild Captain. When it enters the battlefield, we become the monarch, and whenever an opponent attacks us while we're the monarch, this will deal damage to that player equal to the number of cards in their hand. So this may discourage them from attacking us, but whenever we have cards that love to make people the monarch, players kind of go crazy because they love card draw, so they might be a little silly and they might attack us just to become the monarch. But remember, we have a lot of cards that we can benefit off of when our opponents try to attack us. Now, a really important card is Warstorm Surge. It's a pretty expensive enchantment, but whenever a creature enters the battlefield under our control, we can deal damage equal to its power to any target. Now, we're making a lot of 3/3 ogres, so that's 3 damage, or a lightning bolt per creature that enters our battlefield when our opponent decides to attack us with a creature. So if they attack us with 3 creatures and they don't pay the 9 mana they're supposed to, that means we now have 9 damage and 3/3 ogres. This is a strange type of deck that encourages combat at us, so if you want an odd type of mono red deck, this is the one for you. Next, we're talking about Volrath the Fallen for 3 black. It's a 6/4 shapeshifter, and for 1 and a black, we can discard a creature card from our hand, and Volrath is going to get +X/+X, where X is the discarded card's converted mana cost. So how you can build this is creatures with huge CMC, so Baleful Force. And what's really nice is if we end up casting it instead of discarding it, we can draw a card at our upkeep and lose a life. So this is Phyrexian Arena on a creature, Pestilence Demon, another huge CMC creature, and it also has Pestilence on itself. For 1 black, it can deal 1 damage to each creature and player. Phyrexian Triniform. This was printed in Commander Legends. When it dies, we can create 3/3 colorless Golem artifact creature tokens, and also has Encore for 12, which is nice if we discard it with Volrath, because we can end up using its Encore for the 12 mana. River Demon, an 8 CMC creature. When it enters the battlefield, if we didn't cast it from our hand, we can destroy all non-artifact, non-black creatures, and they can't be regenerated. Now, a huge CMC creature is Draco, so if we discard this, our commander's going to get +16/+16. So we will be able to actually kill somebody with commander damage if we discard this card just for 2 mana. I'm not even going to read what it does. It's a 16 CMC creature, and this will help us win with just commander damage. Now, if we want to make our commander unblockable, we have cards like Whisper Silk Cloak, which it can't be blocked, and it has Shroud, so we can't target it, and more importantly, our opponents can't target it as well. Tainted Strike is another way to actually win the game. We can give our commander Infect until end of turn, so now it has 7 power with this +1 from the card. We just need to discard a creature with 3 CMC or greater, and we can win the game with this. A really cool card in the deck is Strands of Night for 2 black. It's an enchantment. We can pay 2 black, 2 life, sacrifice a swamp. We can return target creature from our grave to the battlefield. So if we need those huge creatures we're discarding, we do have to pay a pretty hefty price of 2 mana, 2 life, and sacrificing a swamp, but this is so powerful, I really think it's worth it. And then also we have Phyrexian Reclamation. We can pay 1 and a black, 2 life, and return a creature card from our graveyard back to our hand, so maybe it's another way to buff up our commander. commander by discarding another huge creature. And last, let's talk about Dothi Embrace, another way to make our commander unblockable. We can pay 2 black to give target creature shadow until end of turn, which means they can't be blocked unless the creature that's blocking them also has shadow. So if you're looking for a deck that abuses huge CMC creatures and it's a Voltron deck, this is the one for you. One of my favorite unique commanders is Shirai Shizo's Caretaker. For 4 and a black, it's a 2/2 spirit, and it says whenever a creature with power 1 or less is put into your graveyard from the battlefield, you may return that card to the battlefield at the beginning of the next end step if Shirai Shizo's Caretaker is still on the battlefield. This deck is literally the definition of value. It takes advantage of creatures with power 1 or less, and it does this a lot with Dusk Legion Zealot. So when this enters the battlefield, we draw a card and we lose a life. But imagine repeatable card draw with a sack outlet. So now we have Smothering Abomination. At the beginning of our upkeep, we sacrifice a creature, and whenever we sacrifice a creature, we draw a card. It can't just be destroyed, it has to be sacrificed. So we sacrifice Dusk Legion Zealot. And at the next end step, which could be our end step, this will enter the battlefield again. We're going to draw a card and lose another life. Burglar Rat, when it enters the battlefield, each opponent discards a card. Well, imagine doing this on everybody's turn, because Shirai cares about the next end step. So this is everybody's end step. So when we have a sack outlet, this gets insane, especially with Serrated Scorpion. When it dies, it deals 2 damage to each opponent and we gain 2 life. So imagine 1 turn cycle, each opponent loses 8 life and we've gained 8. That's 24 damage when we have 3 opponents. Grim Haruspex is another great way to draw cards in this deck because we really care about non-token creatures dying. And there's going to be a lot of them in this deck, especially with Perilous Mirror. When it dies, we can deal 2 damage to any target. So now if there's a pesky creature on our opponent's side, we can take care of that as well. Sky Scanner, when it enters the battlefield, we draw a card. Well, imagine drawing a card on each turn, so we draw 4 cards in 1 turn cycle, and that's very powerful, especially with Viscera Seer. We can sacrifice a creature and we get to scry one. When we scry a couple times in 1 turn, it's as if we've drawn a card. And another powerful one is Weaponcraft Enthusiast. It has Fabricate 2, so when this enters the battlefield, we can put 2+1/+1 counters on it, or we can create 2 1/1 colorless servos. So now we can have a huge amount of tokens, or even ways to scry with Viscera Seer, but more importantly, we're going to be sacrificing Weaponcraft before each end step, so on the second main phase of everybody's turn, we can get 2 colorless servos every single time. The last card I want to mention is Desecrated Tomb. So this is an artifact that costs 3 and says whenever 1 or more creature cards leave your graveyard, create a 1/1 black bat creature token with flying. The crazy thing about Desecrated Tomb and Shirai Shizo's Caretaker, normally you just get 1 black bat creature token from Desecrated Tomb, but Shirai words it where for every creature that we get back from our end step, we get 1 black bat creature token. So if we have 5 creatures come back to our battlefield, that means 5 more black bat creature tokens on our battlefield as well, which is more sack fodder, more ways to deal damage to our opponents. This deck has the most value in my opinion out of all of these, so if you're not sure which one to build, this is a great one to start at. Next we're talking about another deck that loves combat. It's Tahngarth First Mate. For 2 red-green, it's a 5/5 Minotaur Warrior. Tahngarth can't be blocked by more than 1 creature, and also it has, whenever an opponent attacks with 1 or more creatures, if Tahngarth is tapped, you may have that opponent gain control of Tahngarth until end of combat. If you do, choose a player or planeswalker that opponent is attacking. Tahngarth is attacking that player or planeswalker. So this deck is also similar to Kazul. We want ways to make our opponents attack beyond their control. So Warmonger Hellkite. All creatures attack each combat if able, and we can make it where the attacking creatures get +1/+0 just for 2 mana, so we can end up helping our opponents kill another one of our opponents. And we can also toss our commander in there to deal 5 commander damage, and it can't be blocked by more than 1 creature, so hopefully they won't be able to kill our commander. And we can always protect our commander with cards like Darksteel Plate. It's an indestructible equipment, and it can make our commander also indestructible if we equip it for 2 mana. Now how we can promote combat in other ways is Shiny Impetus. This is an aura that can enchant a creature. It's going to get +2/+2 and it's goaded, so it attacks every combat if able, and it attacks a player other than you, which is really nice if possible. And whenever it attacks, we're going to create a treasure token. Now an important note is that whenever we equip things that say whenever this creature attacks, we don't really want to put it on Tahngarth because we don't get the benefit of his second ability, which is whenever an opponent attacks we can have Tahngarth join in as well. We don't get that attack trigger from him because they've already declared attacks and then he gets to join along as well. So we want to enchant a creature our opponent already has, and so that way they're always going to be able to attack and hopefully not us, and we also get a treasure token, which is really sweet. Rogue's Glove is going to make it where if our commander does deal combat damage to a player, we get to draw a card. Rite of the Raging Storm is going to make it where our opponents are going to get a 5/1 with trample trample until end of turn. They can't hit us, and hopefully they're going to be able to swing at our opponents. So that's another way we can also win. Our opponents are just hopefully hitting each other. And last, we can buff up our commander with cards like Skarg the Rage Pit. We can always tap it for a colorless, or we can pay a red and green to give target creature +1/+1 and trample, which our commander doesn't have. So this is very nice to also add to it. Now it's a 6/6 with trample and can't be blocked by more than one creature. So if you want to promote even more combat and be able to have your commander join along, this is a great one for you. Another interesting commander is Runetail Kitsune Ascendant for 2 and a white. It's a 2/2 Fox Monk. When you have 30 or more life, flip Runetail Kitsune Ascendant. Well, if we cast this turn 3, it's really likely we're going to have 30 or more life. So when we flip this card, we get a legendary enchantment. We can prevent all damage that would be dealt to creatures you control. This deck is really cool because now that we prevent all damage dealt to our creatures, we have cards like Wall of Glare, Palace Guard, and Guardian of the Gateless. These can block any number of creatures, so if our opponents try to attack us with a million creatures, it doesn't matter anymore. Our creatures aren't going to take any damage, and now nothing's going to get through with these types of creatures. We can have board wipes like Wave of Reckoning, where each creature deals damage to itself equal to its power. Well, again, we prevent all damage, so this is a board wipe for everyone except us. Now, where this gets really silly is cards like Pariah. All damage that would be dealt to you is dealt to enchanted creature instead. So now we're not taking any damage because our creatures should be, but we are preventing all damage that would be dealt to them. Same with Protector of the Crown. We can become the Monarch, and all damage that is dealt to us is dealt to Protector of the Crown instead. Same with Palisade Giant. All damage that would be dealt to us or another permanent you control is now dealt to Palisade Giant. And since we are no longer taking damage as well as our creatures, we can start casting things like Luminarch Ascension, which normally we have 4 of our opponent's end steps to be able to have this crazy ability where we just pay 2 mana to create a 4/4 white angel creature token with flying. Well, we don't lose any life because we don't take any damage, so this is a great card, as well as Court of Grace. When it enters the battlefield, we become the Monarch, and at the beginning of our upkeep, instead of creating a 1/1 white spirit creature token, if we're the Monarch, we get a 4/4 white angel creature token with flying instead. And last, we can win the game with Felidar Sovereign. It's very likely we're not going to be losing any life because we no longer take the damage, and neither do our creatures, so at the beginning of our upkeep, if we have 40 or more life, we're going to win the game. So if you don't like taking damage as well as your creatures, this might be the deck for you. Next, we're talking about Vati Ildal for 2 black and green. It's a 3/3 human warrior. We can tap Vati, and until end of turn, target creature has base power or base toughness 1. When it comes to this deck, we're going to be choosing base toughness 1. And the reason why that is because we have silly cards like Knight of Souls Betrayal. This is an enchantment where all creatures get -1/-1. Whenever we give target creature base toughness 1, they're now going to die due to this. Same goes for Karavek the Spiteful. Other creatures get -1/-1. And then we have Ascendant of Evan Carr. Other black creatures get +1/+1. Non-black creatures get -1/-1. So if their creature happens to be a non-black creature, this will also kill them as well. And we can start drawing cards when our opponent's creatures die with cards like Death Reap Ritual. It has Morbid, which means at the beginning of each end step, if a creature died this turn, you may draw a card. So we can start drawing a lot of cards at everyone's end step. We can even repeat our commander's ability with cards like Instill Energy. It's an enchantment aura that can make it where we can untap our commander for 0 mana, but we can only use this during our turn and only once each turn. So we can at least get our commander's ability off 2 times. A very powerful board wipe is Massacre Worm. When it enters the battlefield, creatures your opponents control get -2/-2 until end of turn, so this is a small board wipe, but whenever a creature an opponent controls dies, that player loses 2 life. So this is besides the board wipe when it enters the battlefield. So anytime a creature our opponent controls dies, this can be from our commander, they're going to lose 2 life. We also have Pestilence, where we can pay 1 black to deal 1 damage to each creature and player. So again, this is another way to keep destroying our opponent's creatures. Soul Snuffers is going to make it where when it comes into play, we can put a -1/-1 counter on each creature. And Staff of Nin is really good in this deck because we can tap it to deal 1 damage to any target, and we can also draw a card at our upkeep. A really silly card is Tree of Perdition. What we would do in this case is we would tap our commander and make it where Tree of Perdition now has base toughness 1. When we tap Tree of Perdition, we exchange life totals of target opponent's life with Tree of Perdition's toughness, which is usually 13, but now it's 1. So our opponent will have 1 life, and this is a really silly card to use. So if you're just looking for a weird deck, this is a perfect one for you. The next commander we're talking about is Blindseer for 2 and 2 blue. It's a 3/3 human wizard, where we can pay 1 and a blue. Target spell or permanent becomes the color of your choice until end of turn. Now, normally people would be like, okay, this is a really lame commander. Well, Turns out it's a sick commander, so let's talk about that. So since we're targeting spells or permanents, we have to mention Willbreaker. Whenever a creature an opponent controls becomes the target of a spell or ability you control, gain control of that creature, so for 2 mana we can start gaining control of our opponent's creatures. And we can also be really mean with cards like Dismiss into Dream. It's an enchantment where it says, each creature your opponents control is an illusion in addition to its other types. And it has, when this creature becomes the target of a spell or ability, sacrifice it. I know this is 7 mana, but this is just a crazy card to have in this deck. For 2 mana we can destroy a creature of theirs. Next we're talking about Douse. For 1 and a blue we can counter target red spell, play this ability as an interrupt. So now we can pay 4 mana to counter a spell, and it's not even a spell, this is an ability that we're activating, so it's going to be a lot harder for our opponents to interact with. And we can even make it cheaper with Heartstone. This is going to make it where the cost of each creature ability requiring an activation cost is reduced by 1. So now we're just paying 1 blue from our commander instead of 1 and a blue, and that's going to help us a lot with our mana. Next we're talking about Hibernation. 3 mana, it's an instant. We can return all green permanents to their owner's hands. Now normally this isn't very good because it's very focused on just green permanents. Well, now we can pay 2 mana or even 1 blue with Heartstone, reducing the 1 colorless from our commander, to start making permanents of our opponents green. So this can be a very harsh board wipe. King Crab. For 1 and a blue, we can tap it, put target green creature on top of owner's library. In total, we can pay 4 mana to start putting our opponent's creatures on top of their library, and this gets super annoying, especially because maybe they want to draw into a land, or even a card draw spell. Actually, it's going to be that creature you just had on the battlefield, and you're going to keep drawing that every turn. So if you normally like janky decks, this is probably the one for you. The final commander we're talking about is Kelsien the Plague. For red, white, black, it's a 2/2 human assassin with vigilance and haste. Kelsien the Plague gets +1/+1 for each experience counter you have. We can tap it and it's going to deal 1 damage to target creature you don't control. When that creature dies this turn, you get an experience counter. So we can really abuse our commander's ability with cards that give our commander Death Touch. For example, we have Falthis Shadowcat Familiar. This is going to give our commanders Menace and Death Touch. We also have Basilisk Caller. It's going to give our commander Death Touch and Lifelink. Or we can have cards like Death Pits of Wrath, where it says whenever a creature is dealt damage, destroy it, it can't be regenerated. Gift of Doom can give our commander Death Touch and Indestructible, which is really nice because our commanders are very important to us. We want to be able to destroy whatever creatures our opponents may have. Goblin Sharpshooter is another sweet card to have because it isn't going to untap during our untap step, but when a creature dies, we get to untap it and then we can start tapping it to deal 1 damage to any target. So this could work with Death Pits of Wrath, or just when our commander kills a creature, we're going to be able to untap it and start dealing 1 damage to an opponent or whatever creature we need to. Mage Right Stun is going to make it where we can untap our commander just for 1 mana, so that's another creature we can kill. Or we have Retreat to Hagra. We can give our commander Death Touch whenever we play a land, and it gets +1/+0. And last, let's talk about how we can possibly win the game. We have Revel in Riches. It's an enchantment that says whenever a creature an opponent controls dies, create a colorless treasure token. At the beginning of your upkeep, if you control 10 or more treasure tokens, you win the game. If you like this video, you're going to love this whole playlist right here. I talk about the most fun commanders you should be playing and that are fun to play against.